is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
In 2013, the United Nations proclaimed the 3rd of March as the World Wildlife Day to celebrate and raise awareness of the world's wild fauna and flora. But on its 5th anniversary, Africa now faces a threat so dire that it could see large portions of these wiped out entirely. Parts of southern and East Africa as well as the Sahel are battling one of the worst droughts in recent history. Very low rainfall coupled with high temperatures has exhausted people's ability to cope with drier conditions and scarce and unpredictable rains. And as a global hub of wild fauna and flora, Africa's wildlife is bearing the brunt as well. So on World Wildlife Day 2018, how exactly did the continent find itself in this position? And what can be done to lessen the impact of the drought on Africa's wildlife? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, wildlife officials have warned that animals across the continent are facing grave danger following the drying up of water sources. They've blamed climate change and agricultural activities for the drying up of vital rivers that have been feeding areas for decades, warning that the drought will only get worse in the next few years if drastic measures are not taken. Let's take a short look at the extent of the droughts across Africa.
Nearly 250,000 Africans have been pushed into hunger by drought and conflict, according to the UN. And that's just the human cost. The damage to the ecosystem is equally jarring. But it could get worse. A pair of new studies published in Nature Climate Change reveal that Earth is in the midst of a decades-long climate-fueled transformation that may be impossible to reverse. Since 2011, wave after wave of drought has swept across Africa, with the Horn engulfed in what was said to be the worst in 60 years, triggering severe food crises across Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia and Kenya. Up north in the Sahel, Chad's Fire Lago area reached 47.6 degrees Celsius on June 22, 2010, breaking a record set in 1961 at the same location. Shuddering under wave after wave of droughts, the Lake Chad Basin has been called Africa's forgotten crisis. Observers say Lake Chad Basin's situation has been egregiously overlooked. The crisis could affect the security, economic, environmental and institutional integrity of Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad and Niger. Down south, South Africa has declared a national disaster over the drought-afflicting southern and western regions, including Cape Town. Though the city has pushed back its day zero, the date when its taps are expected to run dry, it could become the first city in the world to run out of water. But to what extent has this raging drought deepened the human-wildlife conflict across Africa?
And joining me now to provide some more insights into the threat the drought poses to both wildlife and the livelihoods of the millions who depend on these ecosystems is the president of the Africa Wildlife Foundation, Kadu Sebunya. Thank you for joining us on the program and welcome to Talk Africa. Now,
pleasure.
We've just been talking about drought and the scale of drought in East Africa, particularly since 2014. But first of all, before we look at the threat that this has caused on the ecosystem or caused on the wildlife, map for us the scale of the current drought in the Sahel, in the East African region and in the southern region.
I think currently we've witnessed, especially last year, the hottest period Africa has ever had. And this is going to continue moving forward. And the reason for that is how human beings are dealing with natural resources, how we are managing this world, how we are managing our home. It's really striking that this has been happening and we've been witnessing that. I'll give you an example. Chad, Lake Chad, which is one of the largest lakes in Africa, Central Africa especially, it's a third of its original size. And it's dwindling. But more than 5 million people depend on that ecosystem. As we speak, UNICEF is predicting about 2 million people need humanitarian assistance.
So, people are going to be asking, how did we get there?
It's a lot of reasons. One is the abundance of natural resources, which we are so lucky as Africans. This continent has abundance of natural resources. We've been using and thinking that it's free, that we don't need to invest back. Right now, as other factors started kicking in, population is growing, food demand is increasing. Also, our plans for our economic aspirations are calling in for investments, which is opening up a lot of land. So there's a competition in land use. Wildlife, which has been maintaining these resources for free, is being impacted by our activities, and that has lessened the services which has been provided from ecological systems.
So when we talk about this is now impacting on the wildlife, human activities or whatever activities, climatic changes are impacting on the wildlife, what is the biggest impact that we are seeing in terms of the wildlife?
I think what you see with human, I've talked about millions of people now needing humanitarian aid, for example, around Lake Chad, and you can go across the countries in Africa. Just imagine what's going on with wildlife, because statistics, we are getting it from human beings because we care so much about ourselves. But just think about it. An elephant needs between 150 to 200 liters of water a day. Now, an elephant lives on land. How about the hippos, who need to spend a day in water? The crocodiles, the birds, they get water from our freshwater lakes. It's so real that this wildlife, we've fenced them off, or we've done all these buffers around their land. They can't go anywhere to get these water resources. So they depend on the water basins, which are within either protected areas or nature reserves. So if those dwindles, they have no option. So they die. And when they die, we reduce those services that are provided by this wildlife to maintain the ecosystems we need for our own lives.
So we're talking about the worst case scenarios in the event that our rivers and our lakes continue drying up. When you look at what exactly it is that we are not doing right, what should we do about it?
I think one thing we need to do is connecting the ecological services provided by these systems to our livelihoods and to our needs. That hasn't happened yet. We are developing our economic development plans. You look at all countries, we have the 2030, 2020 economic development plans. The entire Africa, we have our Agenda 2063. It's an economic development plan. What we haven't done, and we need to do very, very quickly, is the role of wildlands around our economic development plans. If we don't do that, it's science. We are not going to be successful in all our plans. Look, I'll give an example of agriculture. A lot of countries across the continent are investing in agriculture systems because of food security, and people need to eat. But we also know that 80% of food produced on this continent is rain-fed. We also know where rain comes from. But there's very little investment in forests, in wildlands, in wetlands, where rain comes from to provide for our agriculture. It's as simple as that. It's primary education, knowledge. But the connection between, look at our investments, then look at our budgets. We invest so much millions of dollars in agriculture and very little in servicing our forests that provides rainfall. And I can talk, there's so many examples. Hydro. Our energy, and we have the biggest comparative advantage for our energy source is hydro and solar. Now the investment is more in hydro. Hydro needs water to run through these systems. Water comes from forests, and majority of it from national parks. I would like to hear, for example, here I'm based in Nairobi, I would like to hear the central bank governor in June next year reading a Kenyan budget to tell us the contribution Why is wildlife important to the budget being read by the Minister of Finance? Until we started demanding these, asking these questions, and thinking that forest is about timber, and thinking that the contribution of forests is how much timber we exported, we are going to lose quite a lot. So the role is going to be citizens and governments. But governments have made out systems. They service systems. The priority has been so much on economic aspirations of the citizens who vote in governments. But citizens need also to ask questions about the services. And the only way citizens can do that, we need to raise awareness.
Right.
For some of us who are in this industry, and African Wildlife Foundation is, we are trying to build systems and platforms where citizens are helped to understand that these connections between their aspirations and what nature provides. But also, very, very quickly on that, it has to be that African voice. Because a lot of that message and explanation has been so much from foreigners who have been caring so much about our natural systems and natural resources. That has to change, and Africans, we need to step up and get into this voice and explain to our fellow Africans why this is important.
When you look at the countries, though, because you've talked about the dwindling rivers and lakes, and you've talked about the diminishing Lake Chad and our diminishing forest cover. When you look at several countries, though, which ones in Africa would you point to as having proper environmental policies that have mitigated against, drought and its worsening impact on the ecosystem?
There are pockets, and I think that across the board, most African governments have excellent policies. Very good institutions being developed around natural resource management. What we haven't seen across the board is the implementation of some of these policies as spelled out by our parliaments or the policymakers in this government. So the issue is not lack of good policies. What hasn't happened is the investments that are required to back up the implementation of the policies. Another thing what has happened is the connectivity between these institutions. Ministry of Environment is separate from Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Health. The connection between these ministries has to happen as quickly as possible. Because, for example, the more that drought increases, which is related to natural resources, you get problems with the food security. You get problems with acute malnutrition because of food. You get problems with the forced displacement of people. You get problems with human-wildlife conflicts because now you get wildlife fighting for resources like water as well as human beings, and you get a conflict. So it brews up into insecurity. So this is so real to our security, food security, so real for our general security, is so real for our livelihood in terms of food security. The connection is real. So we would like to see budgets around the policies.
Right.
We really need to see a discussion between rural development, health systems, financing, Ministry of Finance, the planning, Ministry of Planning, with wildlife. To sum up, we wanted Africa to define the role of wildlife and wildlands in a modern Africa.
So there is, of course, there's some issues that you would be recommending, as you've mentioned, what needs to be done. What do you see as long-term strategies if Africa is to be self-sustaining in this area?
The long-term aspect of that is raising awareness, engagement of the young Africans, who are the majority on this continent, on this issue, investments around natural resource management. But I think that has to be anchored by the idea of what do we want for our wildlife and wildlands. What is it? What's the vision for Africa? What is the Africa we want to have and live for our children? That has to be defined. Growing up, I'm 53. Growing up, I knew that my parents were aspiring for an independent Africa. As a young person, that was the conversation of that generation. They want an independent Africa. Today, Africa is independent. it's more educated, it's more exposed, it's more richer, we live longer. Now, this generation of ours, we need to sit and define what is it we want for Africa. It can't be only economic development. It can't be only this boom we have now. We are the fastest growing continent on the planet. It is not sustainable if we are not taking care of the ecological systems. I call them infrastructure. If you want a road infrastructure, if you want infrastructure for the industry, you also need ecological infrastructure that supports the other infrastructure necessary for our economy, necessary for our food security, necessary for our security to be sustained for the next generation.
All right, Kadu Sebunya, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you very much for your insights here. That was Kadu Sebunya, President of the African Wildlife Foundation. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have more discussion on the drought in Africa and the threat it poses to the continent's wildlife. Stay with us.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. And now to offer more insights into the threat posed by drought to Africa's wildlife, I'm joined in studio by expert guests, Dr. Yusuf Aidan, Wildlife Program Manager at the World Wildlife Fund, and John Kagwe, Assistant Director at the Kenya Wildlife Services. To you both, thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. Now, John, let me start off with you because Kenya has been talking about prolonged drought, recurrent droughts, persistent droughts since at least 2014. What impact is this having, though, on wildlife on the ground?
It has had a serious impact on wildlife, yeah, because once all the water sources dry up, the wildlife are forced to go to community land where they have water ponds, dams, and individual water tanks. So they end up bringing conflict.
Are you seeing, though, sort of increased conflicts as a result of this? I mean, given the cases that you're recording at your organization at the Kenya Wildlife Services, are you seeing an increased conflict between humans and wildlife as a result?
Yes, it has resulted, especially in 2017. We are all aware of, especially in a place like Laikipia, there were 2 issues there. When there is drought, pasture does not grow. So our neighboring pastoralist communities bring livestock to private land. So that already is conflict. Number 2, the water sources have dried up, and sometimes it's a challenge to accommodate both the wildlife and livestock. And of course, very important, the local communities.
Dr. Aidan, let's hear your view, though, across the continent. What kind of challenges are we currently experiencing in regards to the conditions of wildlife as a result of these climatic changes?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me on this show. Drought is really a critical problem for wildlife and also humans. And if you look at Africa now, especially the Horn of Africa, Sahel, and the southern African countries, they are experiencing severe drought. And for that reason, of course, there is shortage of water, there is shortage of pasture. If I give just an example of what happened in Kenya in the peak of drought in 2007, we lost about 300 elephants. Those numbers are higher than elephant mortality that has been recorded in Kenya in the recent past. And it's always assumed that, for example, elephants, because they are generalist feeders, they can be able to persist drought condition. But even as resilient as they starved to death. And so are many other animals, like, for example, the zebras, the buffaloes,
right,
etc. So it's quite severe, I would say.
What about other areas, though, like in the Sahel region, in southern African areas? Because we know that at the moment, Cape Town particularly is losing out on its water.
The same case in South Africa, like, for example, if we talk about Kruger National Park and the neighboring reserves, what they have done is during dry season, they have done provisioning for wildlife. So they have put dams so that especially the water-dependent species like elephants can be able to access this water. While that is now a mitigation measure to ensure that elephants do not die of drought, they end up concentrating in areas close to water sources, and these ecosystems are very fragile. These animals are supposed to migrate from an area of drought to an area where, you know, they can find enough forage and water. For that reason, then they have recorded a lot of mortalities for buffaloes, for hippos, for zebras, and many other species. So it is quite a big problem, I would say.
John, in your area, though, how are you mitigating this? I mean, in the event that the animals are pushed out of their protected areas, how are you handling that conflict?
Yeah, I'll give the example of what happened towards the end of last year in Lake Kenyatta in Lamu County. The lake dried up, and we had hippos. And these hippos are used to fresh water. Some ended up in the Indian Ocean, and they died because of dehydration, very severe dehydration. To mitigate that, ourselves with stakeholders, friends of conservation, we were water trucking. We had water boozers draining some water in a pool, which was a temporary measure until the rains. And we thank God in November we got some pretty good rains, and things are back to normal there. In other areas, it's not only for the wildlife, but also for the community, because the community take care of this wildlife. As you know, 65% of wildlife is outside protected areas. So we work very closely with the communities, yeah, so that they benefit, and also the wildlife do benefit to release the pressures of the severe drought.
Dr. Eden, of course, different areas have different approaches in dealing with the human-wildlife conflict. Now, what are the measures, though, in your estimate that seem to have worked, the approaches that seem to have worked in dealing with this situation?
Well, I would say there is no silver bullet to deal with the human-wildlife conflict. Of course, different measures have been tried in different areas in Africa. As I've started by saying, provisioning of water, for example, is one method, so that at least water-dependent animals can be able to access this water. For some species, such as hippos, maybe provisioning of forage could be another method. In my estimation, I think one of the most sustainable ways of dealing with this is maybe to look at the land use patterns. One way of doing that is to look at which areas are appropriate for wildlife conservation, which areas are appropriate for agriculture, which areas are appropriate for livestock, etc. So that when this is done, then wildlife, livestock, and farmers can be able to then live in harmony without having to clash with each other. I think the problem is more than just what the communities or the conservationists can be able to deal with. It's more tied to climate change, right. And climate change is a global problem because the causes of climate change, as we know it, is emission of greenhouse gases, and these cannot be controlled at local level. So I think there is a responsibility that we have as humanity to try and reduce our emissions so that we try and keep the climate change at a manageable level, so that we are able then to get rains at the right time. we can get the rivers flowing and the forage enough for this wildlife to be able to survive.
Right. Let's see if yours, though, John, the approaches that have worked in the Kenyan scenario, though, what has worked for you and what is clearly proving not to work?
Okay, the challenge has been outside the protected areas, there's been overgrazing. So there is a lot of over-erosion. So even if it does rain, the amount of pasture is very limited. So the challenge has been with the severe drought, our communities, including communities from very far. Example, you have livestock coming all the way from northeastern Kenya to the Sahel, the Taita ranches and so forth. That's a long distance. They actually attract in because they've managed to do their habitat in terms of pasture is well managed. You can find an area going for 3 to 4 years, not sufficient rains, and there is livestock. So the areas which have managed to take care of their pasture
right.
are now being affected negatively.
Dr. Aidan, is there a knock-off effect, though, as well on the plants as a result?
Absolutely. I mean, wildlife cannot exist without plants. The habitat where wildlife exists is as important as the species that we are looking at. So looking at landscape approach, ecosystem as a whole, we need to protect our forests. We need to protect our rangelands where these wildlife species exist. So, of course, drought affects plant as much as it affects animals. And when plants are affected, animals do not have food to survive on. So we need to look at it holistically. We need not just to look and focus at species, but look at the habitat where these species exist.
Right. John, I want to get a final comment from you, though. What do you think should be done, though, to lessen the impact of drought on wildlife?
Yeah, I think we should embrace to rehabilitate areas which are degraded. Then we have national tree planting days. If we can plant more trees so that they can mitigate on the issue of the climate change, that will also help. Number 3, desilting of water ponds, dams, and I know the government of Kenya is putting measures in place where water cannot, not only for human consumption, livestock, but also for irrigation. So I think with those 3 steps, we'll be heading towards the right direction.
All right, John Kruger and Dr. Aidan, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Well, that's all we have time for this week, but thank you to my guests for their insights. Dr. Yusuf Aidan, Wildlife Program Manager at the World Wildlife Fund, and John Kruger, Assistant Director at the Kenya Wildlife Service. To you both, I thank you again for being on the program. Well, remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, it's goodbye.